Hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth Wilson from the Irving Institute for Energy and Society. I'm really excited to be here today for our new energy series, Conversations with Early Career Researchers. As a reminder, we started this series almost 9 months ago now during the COVID times to really highlight the very exciting work of young colleagues and scholars. And today I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to Cale Reeves, who I've known since he was a graduate student at University of Texas. He's now a visiting assistant professor at Georgia Tech. And today he'll be talking about his research, generating insight from the bottom up, agent-based modeling of home energy technology diffusion. And for the Q&A period, just so you know, he's also in Austin, Texas right now and can speak a little bit to the technical.
All right, I think hopefully my screen share is working correctly.
Looks great.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be virtually joining everyone here. I've attended several of these. It's a fantastic series and I'm happy to be able to contribute a bit. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about generating insight from the bottom up. And I'd be remiss if I didn't begin with some acknowledgements. The work that I'm going to share with you today rests on the shoulders of many folks, some of whom you see listed here. So thank you and go Team Science. Let's get into it with a bit of an overview, all right? So you are here. We're going to start with some modeling. We're going to discuss modeling. We're going to go down a rabbit hole, and we have to. But we're going to climb back out of it with some discussions that relate to energy and diffusion modeling, and then we're going to touch on some exciting insights as a segue to Q&A. So let's get into it. I want to start with a quote. And the reason I want to start with this quote is because I like the notion that modeling is to reveal what a thing is like. And I like how open-ended that is, because things can be like a lot of other things. And that open-endedness is really going to play throughout this conversation. So let's talk about what is diffusion like. So diffusion in a system, for example, the diffusion of residential solar PV as a function of adoption decisions, kind of looks like this, right? As gray gives way to red, we also have this cumulative diffusion curve that shows sort of how things are progressing. And we can then ask, so what is this system like? And there's a lot of different ways to answer that, right? We can think about maybe latching on to the cumulative diffusion curve and saying, okay, what is that like? Well, it's like a sigmoid curve. And we can model that sigmoid curve with a curve fitting exercise, right? We step back to about halfway through that diffusion process, and we can fit this curve with some fancy parameters, and it gives us some idea about what we should expect in the future, what level of diffusion, of progress of the system we should expect. And this is a classic sort of a top-down predictive modeling approach, right? We have some idea of what to expect. But that's not the only thing the system's like. Suppose we then looked at the progression of red through gray and thought, you know, as red diffuses, a square can either be red or gray. And that starts to sound like a classification problem. And we can think about modeling that with logistic regression. And we build this logistic model and we fit it to the data that we observe here with this pattern of diffusion of red through gray. And we fit this model that predicts redness as a function of, let's say, the number of neighbors of a particular square that are red. We come up with some coefficients, and these coefficients tell us something interesting about what the system's like, about how we could think about interacting with this system, how we could think about changing the probability that a square takes on red by changing the number of its neighbors. This is a classic top-down explanatory model. We have some idea that neighbors explain redness. Or we could think about modeling the system in a different way, about thinking about what it's like a little differently. We could think about the decision to be red as opposed to gray as an individual level decision, and we could model that with a simple rule. We could think about a rule that says, hey, if one of your neighbors is red, then the probability that you choose to be red is a function of the number of your neighbors that are red. I happen to know that this is the simple rule that defines this system. So, we're a step ahead there. But if we model this thing as an individual decision from the bottom up, then we're actually kind of modeling that decision making directly. And that does some interesting things. So modeling this system from the bottom up is going to use rules like this to explain a system generatively, such that macro level characteristics like that cumulative diffusion curve emerge from the interacting of the rules with the environment. And this brings us to an idea called docking, where one description of the system, say the bottom up, can dock with other descriptions of the system, say from the top down. Really what this means is that we've described the same thing in 3 different ways. And the interesting thing there is that different insights can emerge from the different ways we describe the system. And this relates to something which I'll call the generative epistemology, but which Epstein calls the generative motto, which is, if you didn't grow it from the bottom up, if you didn't grow it, you didn't explain it, which doesn't say that you did explain it. It leaves the door open for multiple explanations, for multiple candidates for explanation. And that openness is something that can be valuable for generating insight in different ways. So let's take some of these ideas and start to kind of map things that we know about solar PV adoption and diffusion. So we know that money plays a role. Solar is expensive. Rebates are a part of the mix. So money's going to play a role in determining when folks put solar panels on their roof, right? Folks are going to install when they can afford. And that installation process also does some interesting things, which is it helps to develop new technologies for installing, right? There's a learning curve that actually helps to decrease the costs associated with installation. So we can think about that as being sort of one idea. And we know, though, that in solar PV adoption, that's not the only thing at play. We know that advocacy is a part of this system, right? Folks like to go share information with others because in this system, it's an important feature, the social norms surrounding residential solar PV. Folks like to interact with their neighbors and gain new information and have trusted sources of information that then help them decide to have folks install panels on their roof. If we combine all of these things together, we also have a hope, at least, that all of these things together help us avoid smog down, right? We hope to get some benefits to avoid some deleterious effects. So we can formalize these arrangements into a system, right? Composed of subsystems where rebates interact with prices, right? Increasing rebates, decrease prices. Decreasing prices, increase adoption. Increasing adoption increases learning. Increasing learning decreases costs. And decreasing costs then decrease prices. So we can describe that as being an economic subsystem that is a part of adoption. On the other hand, we have an information subsystem where advocacy increases social norms then increase adoption, and adoption then acts to increase social norms again, sort of feeding back in this informational subsystem. And then all of these things happen together to generate adoption, which then generates benefits. All right, that's the reason we're there. Let's focus in on the core of that system, the adoption decision-making process. And we'll think of this as having sort of 2 primary drivers. One is the social norms coming from the informational subsystem, and the other is prices, which, when policies at play enacting rebates, then the rebates flow through the prices and impact adoption. So if we take that decision-making process and operationalize it in an empirical setting, we might find ourselves building an empirically grounded agent-based model, right? A bottom-up approach to explaining the diffusion of residential solar PV that's tied to an actual empirical setting. For example, this one's tied to Austin, Texas, all right? Where the agents in this system can be actual single-family households, real GIS resolved data points that have characteristics of actual households, right? We know something about these households' access to economic resources through tax assessor data, where we, for example, might use home value as a proxy for wealth. And then we layer multiple data sources on top of one another to really generate a high resolution picture of the agents in this system, where we also have some idea about their access to informational resources through surveys and survey data. And we can describe the distribution of information in the system. We also have an idea about the environment in which these decisions are made by these agents, which is described in part through an economic context driven by installation prices, right? Generally decreasing over time. We also have a policy context for each of these decisions, which includes ideas about rebates and tariffs. And then we have a part of the social, the informational subsystem that is reflected in this environment through the social ties that connect agents and that allow individuals to exchange information with one another across small world networks. And then finally, we have the rules that we're going to use to determine when an agent chooses to adopt. All right, when an agent has sufficient economic resources, we'll say that they're informationally activated. All right, they can afford to adopt solar PV. When an agent has access to sufficient informational resources, we'll say they're informationally activated, which is to say that they want to install solar PV, right? They think it's a good idea. When both of those activations happen at the same time, when an agent both can afford and wants to install solar PV, they choose to install. All right, that's basically how we're going to think about modeling this from the bottom up. That's the rabbit hole. We're going to start to climb out of it now. So I've described the way I'm thinking about this system from the bottom up. Might be natural to ask, does it do any good? So what you're seeing here in yellow is the empirical cumulative adoption curve. And I want you to pay attention to the purple curve. The purple curve is basically the curve of these four models with both the informational subsystem and the economic subsystem sort of turned on, all right? And you can see generally, the purple curve appears to follow this cumulative adoption line in yellow. And we can even zoom in a bit and see here that the purple curve not only generally follows the line, but it captures this interesting sort of idiosyncratic feature in the empirical cumulative adoptions. It's capturing that little dip there, which means that this model is picking up on features in the system, embedded in the system, in such a way that the emergent characteristics track with the actual observed phenomena. So how does it work over space? That was time, this is space. We can see the empirical density has these hot spots, right? And the base case model, that purple model, is capturing some of these hot spots of adoption and also capturing some of the low spots. This model generally has low error and high spatial accuracy. It appears to be capturing something about the system that's there, but from the bottom up as opposed to from the top down. So now that we've done that, what do we do with it? Well, let's take it for a run. Let's think now about accelerated adoptions versus additional adoptions. What we're going to do is, because we've modeled that decision-making process as a function of several of these two drivers, we're going to think about which was the last touch, all right? Which was the spark event that actually resulted in the adoption decision? When that spark event is economic, when the last touch comes from that economic subsystem, we're going to call that an accelerated adoption. Because what happened, well, basically somebody was interested in installing PV, and then they realized that the price had dropped to a point that they could afford it. They met the reservation price. If that was, for example, caused by a rebate, then we can attribute to that rebate an accelerated adoption. It would have happened later in the context of decreasing prices, but it happened earlier because prices decreased earlier. On the other hand, we can think about when the last touch comes from that informational subsystem, when the last touch was an informational spark. This is a agent who was already able to afford solar PV, but wasn't in the market for it. They didn't want it. And then, due to informational activation, they decided that they wanted it. And so they bought it. We can think of that as being an additional adoption, a sort of a market expansion idea that comes from engaging the informational subsystem. We'll take a look at this idea in the context of the CSI, the California Solar Initiative rebates. This is a model that's fit to San Jose, California. What you're seeing here in yellow is, once again, empirical cumulative adoption curve. And in blue, the factual scenario where we've modeled the pattern in adoption, including the California Solar Initiative rebate, right? This is a model of what actually happened. We can then manipulate the policy context and strip out CSI, simulating a counterfactual scenario with no California Solar Initiative. That's what you're seeing here, the difference between these two lines, the blue factual scenario and the, let's call it salmon, counterfactual scenario, which intuitively has fewer adoptions, 761 fewer adoptions in San Jose in the absence of CSI. So let's dive into that idea about what was the spark event and try and explain why some of those adoptions didn't happen in the counterfactual scenario. So we can see the difference here that 471 of the 1,265 economic spark events were not expected in the counterfactual scenario. This suggests that the CSI rebate was 2/3 accelerated adoptions. On the other hand, 290 of 588 spark events were not informational spark events were not expected in the counterfactual. This suggests that the CSI rebate was about 1/3 additional adoptions, folks that became informationally activated and entered the market for solar PV. This is an important distinction because in some sense, without the CSI rebate, you could have expected prices to decline, just not quite as fast. And so the benefits generated in reduced emissions sort of are occurring earlier, but they probably would have occurred later. So since we've established that these informational spark events in this market expansion idea are interesting, let's think about what practical tools we could use to spark these to incite these informational spark events directly. We can think about modeling informational intervention programs that do just that. Here are 4 archetypes that I model. Now, one I'll call a celebrity advocate. This is where a celebrity or somebody outside of the system provides information to the system and has the potential to reach anybody in it. We'll compare that to, for example, a phone ambassador. This is somebody who's inside the system, but provides information to other people. This is modeled off a program that was done in Oregon, where what they do is they have somebody who is willing to provide information about their recent installation experience to potential adopters, folks that are interested. And it does that by connecting them, all right? It does that by making new social ties, which is fundamentally different than bombarding a system with information from outside. 2 other ones that I model as well, but we're not going to talk too much about, are a porch talk. This is something that was done here in Austin in the Mueller community, where somebody provides information to folks that live in their same geographic radius. And then a community champion, which is somebody who provides information along existing social ties. They basically just go out into their communities and talk to the people they already know. So let's take a look at a snapshot of two impactful mechanisms here, all right? So we're going to look at the celebrity advocate and the phone ambassador. And I want to tell you a little bit about what you're seeing here, all right? Across the x-axis, you're seeing the number of informational seeds. This is essentially how many of these folks you hire. This is a measure of programmatic effort, all right? How much effort are you putting into this program? On the y-axis, you're seeing the effectiveness of each informational seed to reach their potential follow-ons. So for a celebrity advocate, that's the potential to reach anyone in the system. For the phone ambassador, it's the potential to reach those folks that they've been connected to. That's something that you don't have control over as a policy implementer. Now, as we get towards a wider yellower place, you're seeing more additional adoptions. And notice this pattern that we're seeing in celebrity advocate. Unsurprising, very impactful. Add more informational seeds and you hire more celebrities and you get more additional adoptions. That stands in contrast to this phone ambassador program, which very sort of interestingly doesn't appear to be very sensitive to the number of informational seeds. Above a certain point, adding more phone ambassadors really doesn't generate much more additional adoptions. So why is that interesting? Why is that important? Well, in Austin, you might think of a celebrity advocate as being, for example, Matthew McConaughey, all right? And this is a sort of a brute force approach, right? To take somebody external to the system and just bombard the system with information is brute force provision of information. And also, in the case of Matthew McConaughey, I'm gonna guess pretty expensive. Stand that against the phone ambassador. This isn't a brute force approach. This works by restructuring the underlying social network, right? We're adding ties to that network, which works in a different way and achieves a different pattern of effectiveness, but also is probably much less expensive than the celebrity advocate idea, because these are just regular folks who've installed solar and are willing to share their experience, right? Willing to serve as a trusted source of information along a newly created social network connection. Okay, that's some insight into how things are working. What about outcomes? Well, we observe in Austin that the distribution of solar installations is slightly worse with respect to equity than the baseline distribution of home values, which is to say that wealthier folks are installing more solar, all right? Not extremely surprising there. But what happened here is Austin Energy changed the structure of their rebates. They changed from dollars per watt to a flat rebate. When they switched over, it was about 40 cents per watt. They changed to $2,500 per installation flat. And then in the summer of 2019, they had a summer special where they added $1,000 to that. So this change in structure raises some questions. What should they expect, both in terms of installed capacity and also in terms of distributional impacts? Well, because we have this fully resolved system where our agents have additional characteristics, for example, some idea about wealth, some idea about access to economic resources, we can model the change in distributional impacts. As you see here, the Gini coefficient, pseudo-Gini coefficient for distributional equity in solar PV installations improves. It improves considerably from 0.36 to 0.29. But it does so without really changing the cumulative installed capacity. That's over here in the green. So better, more equal distribution of installations, but not much change to installed capacity. What's happening there is that lower wealth households or lower income households are installing more, but not high capacity systems. They're installing smaller systems with the flat rebate. But note that the most vulnerable 25% still are installing less than the distribution of home values, right? So if you want to impact this most vulnerable 25%, then you need another program on top of this flat rebate, right? The flat rebate isn't going to do that for you. Okay, let's take some of these distributional impact ideas, and we're going to, as I promised in the abstract, dip our toes into COVID modeling. All right. Using a very similar idea about a bottom-up approach to modeling the social spread of COVID-19 with fully resolved agents drawn from ACS. They have things like age, income, employment category. We're going to model the social spread of COVID in much the same way along social networks. Now, what you're seeing here is in this black curve, the distribution of hospitalization in that system with response to a shelter-in-place order, all right? Hospitalization goes up, shelter-in-place order turns on, hospitalization goes down. But because we have access to so much information about these agents, we can decompose the prevalence of hospitalization by age. That's what you see in the middle. We can then compare the prevalence of hospitalization by age to the baseline proportion of each of those ages in the system. For example, 18 to 49-year-olds make up 53% of the population that we're looking at. 50 to 64-year-olds are making up 33% of this population. And you can see here that those are experiencing higher than proportional incidence of hospitalization over time. And that's what you're seeing with that little red arrow, all right? So why are these ages causing these distributions in hospitalization over time to be different and disproportional? Well, it's actually baked in to the way the epidemiologists are thinking about modeling the disease progression itself, all right? They use this compartmental idea to model progression from susceptible through exposed to infected to recovered, and interestingly here in IH, from infected to hospitalized, and also deceased, but we don't need to talk about that, it's too sad. The model that the epidemiologists use have this progression from infected to recovered versus hospitalized as dependent on age, right? They're using characteristics of an agent to alter the probability of going to one compartment recovered versus the other hospitalized. So that age feature is actually baked in, but what's not baked in is the distributional impact by income over time. All right, this feature here is coming from the relationship between ages and employment classes and incomes, and also the shelter-in-place orders, and also who is declared essential. What you're seeing here is we have some idea now that earlier shelter-in-place orders might be effective at reducing the overall incidence of hospitalization, but they disproportionately impact the lowest income earners in the system with more hospitalization than they make up of the population at large. So essentially, that benefit in efficacy is borne on the shoulders of the lowest income earners because of the baked-in system of income co-distribution with employment class. So that's some ideas about how technology diffusion modeling feeds into modeling the social spread of COVID-19. Let's go the other way with it. How then is home energy technology co-adoption like COVID-19? Well, that compartmental idea that the epidemiologists use has this idea of path dependence in it. And we see that in home energy technology co-adoption. It also has this dependent on information and agent states, right? That progression dependent on age is similar to things that we see in home energy technology adoption when, for example, a solar PV installer shepherds someone through the entire installation process. source of information there determines some of the outcome. And we can use that to think about modeling the composition, sequence, and timing of co-adoption of entire technology suites. Done some preliminary work in this area where we can think about an agent as being susceptible before they install any technology. And then the first technology, for example, here that they install being a smart thermostat, as conditioning the probability that they will then go on to install more technologies, for example, HVAC or solar PV, which in turn conditions the probability that they go on and complete their set by installing the remaining technology, or even exiting the system and sort of recovering from home energy technology. So that bidirectional feedback loop there between disciplines was interesting, I think. And this is where we land with exciting insights related to modeling from the bottom up. All right, it can use spark events to decompose policy effects into accelerated versus additional adoptions, which has some implications for policy. From the bottom up can provide a framework for modeling flows of information and for comparing informational intervention programs, right? Which are otherwise pretty hard to compare because of spillover effects, because of the very nature of information being something that is shareable amongst individuals. We've explored some emergent distributional impacts, both static and dynamic. And we can relate that to policy timing. And then finally, we've engaged what I think is this really neat cross-disciplinary feedback loop, right, to contribute to advancing how we can think about co-adoption modeling, how we can think about how people decide to install more than one technology and entire suites. Okay, I'm going to end with one more quote, which I think is a good segue into Q&A. Thank you for the time.
I was waiting for you to sing the quote.
I will do you all the pleasure of not.
Thank you so much, Cale, for the really insightful conversation. I saw in the participant list, there's a bunch of former and future new energy speakers. And I know a lot of you guys, your research kind of engages on these topics. So please put some questions in the Q&A box for our conversation. I'm really looking forward to that. I don't have to call you up by name, but oh, good, the questions are coming in. But just to start us out, this was really great, Cale. And one of the pieces that I appreciated was the ability to really think about these systems within shifting policy contexts. And I remember years ago in conversations with Varun Rai, you know, we use these models, and I'm so glad that it tracked better when you actually added in some sort of, you know, psychological variables, how we communicate and other things. I'm also wondering if you've ever thought about using models coming from ecology or coming from public health to think about the energy system. I mean, you're using those models now to apply to COVID, but I can imagine that some of these like contagion curves and things like that also kind of affect the behaviors in that. And I'm wondering if you ever just imagine something like that.
Yeah, and in fact, so part of feeding what I was exposed to, what I learned from the epidemiologists back into modeling technology diffusion is this idea of, and I only showed the one sort of strain of technology co-adoption, which begins with smart thermostat, but thinking of other strains, one which might begin with solar PV, and that then conditions how you move through the compartments associated with that strain.
Either making you less or more susceptible, right?
Exactly, and also changing the duration that you spend in a particular thing. For example, folks have a tendency to get HVAC and smart thermostats together. Right. But then again, they also have a tendency to install HVAC when the previous one breaks. Right. So there are different durations that folks will spend in this one technology versus multiple technology space. But yeah, absolutely feeds back from the epidemiology world. And I'm super excited to think about other opportunities where I can model something which, to use my first quote, looks like solar diffusion or technology diffusion, so that I can get more ideas about how to think of that.
I think some people on this talk and some of your colleagues, this sounds like a great NSF workshop. really. And if you wrote this up and got some people from these other disciplines together, this is the kind of thing that in the convergence space, NSF might really be interested in funding. Okay, we've got some questions.
Note taken.
Lisa Schmidt asks, have you applied this technique to adoption of home energy efficiency programs?
Not directly, no. The closest I get is thinking about enrollment in demand side reduction with by basically allowing the utility to control a smart thermostat. But I am extremely interested in what often happens at the early stages of getting a rebate for solar PV is this weatherization idea, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
how that either feeds into the decision to adopt solar PV or the exit of the system, right? I would love to get my hands on these data and figure out how to model that.
Well, and I guess one of my follow-on questions with energy efficiency, a few weeks ago, we had Tony Reeves from University of Michigan speak about the really unequal distribution of benefits from those programs, mostly happening in white wealthy communities, not happening in the Black poor communities. And yesterday we had a history professor, Matt Delmont, talking about the history of redlining and some of the data that shows if you do a home appraisal with Black pictures on the wall, the home is appraising for 40% less than with white pictures on the wall, same house. And so I'm wondering, like, how would you think about addressing some of our just racial inequities in our society in this agent-based modeling? Because if you're looking at like that value of home as your proxy, and that home assessed value has a race bias baked into it, how do we begin to kind of sort that out, or at least think about some of these equity issues in our policy making as we go forward in the space?
Yeah, so I think about that as being a sort of an advantage of this approach is that it does capture these features which are baked into the system. All right,
right.
The joint distribution of home value and race is baked into the system, and that allows us to think about modeling something which doesn't depend on race, but generates race-dependent outcomes because it operates through the home value portion. Does that make
fair,
sense?
but I guess my question is, if you wanted to ensure kind of equal access to solar panels, and I appreciated the difference between the cents per kilowatt hour and the flat cost, because some groups are more sensitive to one and some to the other. But if your kind of basic data is skewed from the beginning and not getting at that, I mean, is that something that you have to tease out, or is it enough to use the data as it is and then try and develop programs around that?
Well, so one thing that you might be able to think about doing is artificially breaking that connection. All right. So then you have one system, which is, we can think about the factual system, which uses that co-distribution to generate some emergent characteristic, and then one in which you've artificially broken that relationship. And then you might be able to then get a good idea of what it would look like if it wasn't baked in. And at least might guide some action.
Here's a question from Michael Craig, who also wants you to sing. So we'll save that for the last few minutes in your last 2-minute wrap up. Thanks for the presentation. Can you speak about how far we can apply this technique with regression, worry about going out of the range of the data? Is it the same here? How about for different income groups? How much can we really learn from late adopters or from early adopters? And then actually, let me add on this question from Greg Sparkman, because I think it's very complimentary here. Great talk. In some of my work, I've looked at how people's attention can be shifted from current levels of behavior to the rate of change. In short, for up and coming sustainable actions, it's more helpful to focus on increasing sustainable trend than it is to focus attention on current levels of participation in absolute terms, which is often low. For modeling social influence and solar adoption, have you thought about modeling the proportion of, sorry, this is a longer question I thought. Have you thought about modeling the proportion of attention focused on static norm information? Few people in my neighborhood have rooftop solar versus dynamic norm information. The installations are increasing over time. Maybe this could account for some of the differences in public facing campaigns. And so this idea of public, that type of campaign, and also the late adopters, early adopters, I thought fit well together.
Well, I haven't thought about giving agents any sort of individual propensity to predict, to think about where trends have gone and where trends are going. At the moment, they all are responding to the situation as they perceive around them immediately. But that's a fantastic idea, and it suggests that that there's a lot of additional cognitive features that could be baked into these agents in the way that they behave. There is some value for parsimony, for having agents which respond in the moment and only to really two drivers. But no, I haven't thought about imbuing them with much extra cognitive capacity. That is something, though, which ties into that idea from the generative modeling epistemology, which is to say that this is a candidate explanation. And there are many more candidate explanations, which is something that I find valuable because the insights I think that we can glean from having it explained one way versus having it explained another way can diverge. And it also points to places where the insights that we glean are robust to candidate explanations, which is also something I spent some time thinking about.
And the candidate explanation is kind of the internal logic of your model is something, but Matteo Barsanati comes up with, ABM models are still somewhat mistrusted by experts in other research fields and by policymakers. Do you think more can and should be done in terms of transparency and reproducibility? And if so, how? And what I appreciated in your study was how much of this is directly applicable to policymaking. I mean, just in terms of evaluation of policy, the cost of different policies, different options, and really allowing you to weigh some of those tweaks that end up being absolutely critical for programmatic implementation. So I think Matteo's question is right on. If we don't trust this, are we going to use it?
Right, and to some degree, that's exactly why I'm excited to be standing in front of you today. There's a lot that folks don't know about how these models work. And in fact, even when you're trying to communicate how a model works, there's different levels at which you can do that. The sort of full specification for one of these models can run to pages. The logistic regression model I showed you, it's this big. And that is remarkably easy to communicate in a way that ABM just aren't. What I hope that we can do is figure out how to prime people to receive this information a little better, which is, I think, accomplished in part by this docking idea, by showing that this agent-based model might be very difficult to understand, but the output that it generates is consistent with the output of other modeling approaches. And
I think you're tracking the empirical data is actually the story that is the most compelling, right?
Yeah. But like these other models, these top-down models don't have the same ability to generate distributional impacts. So by showing that I can generate the same, a consistent world as a top-down model, I think it lends credibility to the thing that I can generate that the top-down models can't.
No, I think that's a really interesting thing. And I mean, back to Matteo's question, the world believes a lot of models that we patently know are false. And so, in some ways there's a myth, close your eyes, look over here, hand holding with a lot of the ways that we model our energy system. And there's been lots of research showing how all of our projections of oil price or gas price or whatever that drive our investment decisions are wrong. Another question from Michael. Have you thought about gaps between value and bridging ABM and energy system models like power system optimization models?
I guess to touch on that, I'm currently engaged in a project where I'm the people guy, and the rest of the team is all very much, the control systems and things of this nature. And my role there is to add some realistic social dynamics to diffusion that then give these control systems, these control algorithms, some realistic idea of what buttons and levers they have access to and when and where.
And to just think about it in a little more nuanced way. I have one question open that I'm going to save for the end, but if any some other questions queue up, that would be great. But actually, could you open up slide 35 again?
35. If I can find my mouse.
And I also appreciated the idea of the celebrity person and Matthew McConaughey. I think up here in New England, it would have been Tom Brady until he, left. But But who do you want as your spokesperson? And probably for different communities, you want different people. I've always appreciated my colleagues who work with the churches, how effective they are. They put the panels on the roofs of the churches, the solar panels, and then the congregation took it out. One of the best strategies, Cale, I heard was in Germany, where they had all of the high school kids do a survey of all of the community members. And then when they did the presentations, everybody in the community had to come. So they had to come hear the high school kids tell them about why they should do solar. Yeah. It was a great research project for the kids. It was wonderful for the community. And then the community had all these kids that wanted to do this. And so it was a real like social buy-in, and the mayor just played it like nothing. It was wonderful.
Yeah, that's a
so fantastic. This space, isn't that great? This delta between the blue and the red, as a policy person, I'm like, what's the value of that delta? Like, how much private capital have I actually activated in this area? Like, you can calculate that, right?
For sure. Yeah, I can add up all of the actual rebates, the paid into that yellow curve.
We can add up the rebates, and we can also add up the value of the solar systems installed. So we can look at kind of capital activated in this thing. We can look at, you looked at the number of homes, which I think was like 761 or something like that. Fewer adoptions, so you had 761 more, and you can figure out what the cost of those is. So there's a value to this and a cost benefit, and that's over this time, and you could also extend it over a 30-year time period, or 20-year time period, whatever the value is. If you're
in this model, these agents are actually getting bids and responding to a bid that they get that's drawn from the distribution prices over time. So yeah, I can then calculate, even for the counterfactual scenario, bids that were accepted and the associated rebates.
And so Greg asks again, using your models, have you compared the cost of efficiency of spending on subsidies versus social information campaigns? And I think that was a few slides down when you were looking at the differences, but that's actually, from a policy maker, you're often making these choices of how do I structure my program and incentive.
Absolutely. Paper I'm working on right now. It's the
this one.
Where in order to sort of compare all of these together, I also include an economic intervention, which generally, if I remember off the top of my head, for every installation you spark with just by giving a rebate, you get about 1.7 additional follow-ons. And then we can think about the effectiveness of these other programs to generate follow-on installations. Yeah, absolutely. That's where I'm playing like right now.
And here you're talking about solar PV. Are there any other programs? I mean, how could this same thing be applied to like a community aggregation PV, or where else would you think about it coming in? I mean, we're looking mostly here at household interventions. Are there any community scale interventions that you think this type of approach could be used for?
Not that I've modeled already, but one thing that I find myself thinking about is, without the economic aspect, this is an information diffusion model, and you can think about that as measuring support. All right, and if most of your community becomes activated informationally, then you can think of there being broad, widespread support for community investment.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting way of just thinking about, community battery storage or community aggregated solar. I want to make sure that we have enough time at the end. So let me ask these last two. The one question here from Anson Gok: can you talk about market reaching full saturation or optimum? And how does this fit in here?
Yeah. So yeah, what level of rooftop penetration is appropriate is a deep and involved question. It's not something that I have an answer for.
Well, you mentioned down in Texas that now houses are listing themselves in the real estate listing as to where they are in the grid.
Anecdotally, I've seen that a house in their ad for MLS to sell their house might say, hey, by the way, we're on a feeder line that doesn't get shut off. Which
that's your experience. You live right next to the fire station.
That's incredible. I never thought that would make it into an ad. I never thought anybody would care about the grid structure enough to put that in an ad. But
yeah, your distribution network is suddenly valuable. You had no idea. We'll be modeling this next month.
Yeah, but yeah, the penetration thing is is interesting. And I don't know exactly where that goes.
Yeah.
I mean,
I want to end with this final question, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of summarize with a few big thoughts of where you want to leave us. This is from Asigir Barlow. I'm sorry if I messed up your name. Thank you for an interesting presentation. I'm a PhD researcher focusing on environmental policy from a social science perspective. What are the major journals that publish ABM studies? Which discipline field of study is ABM most closely connected? And where do you see the most application of this model in the time ahead?
so we've seen even in JPAM a couple of
What? JPAM doing ABM?
yeah.
This is like a whole new world.
There was a series of micro simulations which are they're pretty close. A couple, gosh, maybe 2 years ago. But the communities that I'm active in are like Computational Social Science Society of the Americas. These are rooms where folks get together and they talk about ABM, and they often don't talk about policy. So not only is I think there's space to insert ABM into policy, but there's a huge space to insert policy discussions into the modeling community.
Yes. Yes, and relevant policy discussions. A lot of times we see these theoretical carbon taxes or RPS standards. We're like, no, how about something that people are working on today that are causing so much trouble? I'm going to ask you to give us about 2 minutes, just kind of your big thoughts. Tell us a little bit about where you're going, where you think it's exciting in the future, and then we'll share future programming and wrap up.
Yeah, happy to. So the 2 minute sum up here is, I guess, obviously this is a space in which I play. I may come across as an excited advocate, but I want to take a step back from being an advocate for a modeling approach and thinking about not sort of prescribing an approach before you have a problem, right? The idea here is not that ABM solves everything, but that it complements other approaches. And that to me is how we build a robust way of looking at a problem, of thinking about all of the different ways that we could describe it, about all of the different ways to go back again, of thinking, what is this thing like? And each of those, I think, can contribute an important piece to solving. And we've got wicked problems all around us, cascading crises here in Texas. I think that the more insight we have, the better equipped we're going to be to figure out some way out of it.
Well, and you've shown us a really important tool that will help us ensure that we're asking the right question and using the right tool. Just because it's a nail doesn't mean you hit it with a regression model. And so I really appreciated your nuanced way of kind of taking apart the problem to include both those economic pieces, which I think we've all seen, and also the informational pieces, and marrying them together in a way that's quite meaningful. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to invite you and the rest of the audience to nominate other people to speak in this series. For me, I love seeing friends like Cale, and I love meeting new people and having really interesting conversations on your research and what you're doing. So we set this up a few months ago just to help people keep on sharing their work. So please feel free to nominate folks that you think would be interesting or could use this right now. Just shoot me an email at elizabeth@dartmouth.edu. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cale, for coming. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And thanks also for the audience for being really super and asking great questions. You can tell a lot about how good a series is by the quality of the questions. And I think we got some good ones today. So take care, Cale. Good luck with the new job at Georgia Tech, and let us know if we can help you. You're always invited at Dartmouth. Once you can travel again, feel free to come on up.
I will.
Take care. Yeah,
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.